Please join us again for another great episode of Where Eagles Dare. And in this week, we want to highlight to you the following excerpts.
So Brazil has not outlawed or banned Huawei in any regard. Huawei is very active in Brazil and quite successful in Brazil for many years. And a lot of Brazil's infrastructure is already based on Huawei. In regards of 5G, Brazil is still on the fence. The president staffed the government with more military personnel than the actual dictatorship did. Military dictatorship did, which is, unheard of.
Hi, good evening and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to episode number 4 of Where Eagles Dare. And today I have my dear friend, Kevin Tang, who is been living all over the world, but most recently is back in Rio de Janeiro, where he was born. Kevin is very shy about this, but he comes from one of these cousins of one of the great families in China, the Rong Yuan side of the family, who was the right-hand man to Mao and helped create CITIC. And so Kevin is with us today. Kevin is an excellent raconteur and thinker and strategy guy and all kinds of terrific intellectual curiosity about this guy. So Kevin, here we go. So give us the state of things right now. Brazil has the second largest number of cases in the world after the United States. Where are we in the pandemic for Brazil? Both number 2 for cases and number 2 for deaths.
Yeah, and first, thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure to talk to you, as always, your dear friend. Yeah, the picture here in Brazil is a little bit confusing in the sense that the numbers are not very reliable, and there is a lot of under notification and all the usual problems that we see in a lot of other developing countries, not only in the underdeveloping countries, but even in the US, right? But here I would say everything is magnified. So while Brazil does have the second number of cases worldwide, and I think it's 2.5 million right now as we speak, and obviously this will date the conversation, but we're reaching 90,000 deaths, and it's not easing up, right? So the dynamic of the disease, of the spread, has changed. It's moved from the major population centers like Rio and Sao Paulo, where it started, Fortaleza in the northeast, and obviously even Manaus, which was probably one of the most severely affected. And it's moving to other cities inland and other capitals that were not initially devastated. And those numbers that we see going up are from the new caseloads from the interior of Brazil. So,
right. So heading into the Amazon, heading into Mato Grosso and other on the inland. And you mentioned the cases in Rio, Sao Paulo are stabilizing, falling?
Yeah, they're stabilizing and in some cases even falling. Again, we have to take this with a grain of salt because of the under notification. There's some studies that say that Brazil is even almost 10x under notified. So, I mean, that's just a mind-boggling number. The testing Brazil is very under tested. Testing resources are very low. There's no way that the official numbers capture what exactly is happening real time. But that's just the dynamic of Brazil. And we've been able to, manage somehow, bumble our way through this. So the situation here, I think, just to give you a few numbers of what we're talking about, unemployment is at 13%, which is very high for Brazil standards. You have around 30 million people that are jobless or looking for jobs. GDP is projected to fall. IMF projected 9.1% drop this year in GDP. I would say it's probably closer to 10, maybe a little bit more. Debt to GDP ratio should reach around 98. The central bank just put out a projection for 98% over the next 2 years. and basically the deficit this year will reach 12%. Most of it due obviously to the COVID relief measures. So
Yeah.
Brazil fiscally is in a very dire situation. Brazil economically is in a very dire situation, and socially is in a very dire situation. On top of the last decade, or the last at least 5 years of a very chaotic political and economic situation. So really, COVID has been the icing of the cake when Brazil, allegedly was supposed to recover and show signs of growing again. This really, hit it hard, as obviously the rest of the world, but amplified by its, lack of governance and lack of planning and coordination, its inability to muster the resources to effectively, have a strategy, which, other countries in the region, for example, nearby Argentina, have been more effective in doing. And again, that's a whole different situation on its own, but it's definitely having an impact. No, so basically, Brazil is seeing a lot of the problems that the U.S. has, in again, like I said, politically, socially, economically, but it's a much poorer country, and it doesn't have the tools that the U.S. and the power that the U.S. has to do to fight this disease.
Yeah. So let's move on to now. I want to ask a quick question. What is the state of play with what's happening with Bolsonaro? He's in quarantine. Is he same, better?
So he officially tested negative. So he is recovered, I guess. He got COVID, I think around July 4th or some time near then. And he now just showed his results testing negative, as if he's cured, and basically saying it was not a big deal, as would be expected from him, which is what he has been hammering on since the beginning. And politically, he has been amazingly stable in terms of his approval. It had dropped initially from I think the dynamic is similar to Trump, where he has a solid core base of people who just he can do whatever he wants and say whatever he wants, that he'll still be popular with them. And then you have another level of people, and basically now during COVID, this base. So the hardcore base, I would say, is around 12 to 15%, which is the consensus that everyone has. And then on top of that, his approval, so his approval is around 40%, or fluctuates between 30. It's good. The people who think he's doing a good job is around 30%, and his overall approval is 40% in the latest surveys. And that has shifted. So the difference between the hardcore supporters and the other supporters has changed, in that now you see a big percentage of poorer people in that category, simply because the government has been giving out checks, right? The relief package for the pandemic. The last 3 months, the government has given 600 reais per month, which is about $120, which for 100 million people in Brazil is more than they make on average. So the average income for 100 million people in Brazil, which is about half the population, was around $85 a month. So you can imagine that when the government doles out all this, this money for, several people, that is much more than they receive normally, that increases popularity. The question is what happens after that money runs out, because, the government has been, tapering this relief, and it will run out in the next, 2 to 3 months.
Okay, great. So we're going to move on. Now, let me ask you, what is your take on where we are with this allegiance to the U.S., this Monroe Doctrine, which, says basically to everybody else in the world, stay out of Latin America. It's our backyard, get lost. Is Brazil sort of on the fence about the U.S.? Is it closer to the U.S. now than before? What's your take on that?
So it's definitely closer to the U.S. now than it was before. And again, depends when you date before. Definitely, certainly under the previous government of Dilma and Lula, Temer rekindled that relationship, and Bolsonaro just took it full power, into almost becoming a U.S. Client state. Definitely, Brazil is in the U.S. orbit more than ever. However, it must be said that ideologically, Bolsonaro is very aligned with Trump and with the United States policy overseas. So the China bashing and all the policies towards Israel, Palestine, and around the world. So Brazil has basically become aligned with the U.S. on the diplomatic level. So the foreign minister is very pro U.S. So the top of the government is that. However, Brazil also has to face the reality on the ground, which is China is its biggest economic partner, trade partner, and investment partner. So certain ministries or certain ministers of Brazil are split, right? So you have foreign relations and maybe the environmental and other parts of the government are very pro-aligned with the U.S., but the Ministry of Agriculture and of Infrastructure and other areas which are more China dependent and reliant, are very pragmatic and also represent the interests of the Brazilian agricultural sector and of the investment community.
Right, exactly. And so as usual, this is like the non-aligned movement, and we have to ask, non-aligned with whom? And so Brazil is playing both sides of the fence, basically, right?
Exactly. I mean, ideally, if the government had a choice, it would align with the U.S., but for very pragmatic reasons, and Brazil, as just mentioned, is in a very fragile economic state, has these very strong ties to China, which it cannot afford to break. And I mean, if you look at it from a strategic point of view, Brazil is very important to China as a resource exporter and a food producer, which would imply that if Brazil is automatically aligned with the U.S., or if you bring in Australia into the mix and New Zealand into the mix, you almost have the the OPEC of food producers, of animal protein producers. So those are some considerations if you look at the bigger scale in the world of how Brazil is trying to play and position itself in the global stage. But is just a quick example, Brazil's president's son, who's also a representative in the House, bashed China. The former minister of education bashed China openly on Twitter and was severely rebuked by the Chinese ambassador and the Chinese diplomats in Brazil. Also showing a little bit of China not going to take this quietly, and there are a lot of the battlefronts that you've been talking about. The 5G is definitely a consideration in Brazil. Brazil is a big important battleground, I would say, in this front as well.
Is Brazil on the fence about Huawei, or what's the deal on using Huawei?
So Brazil has not outlawed or banned Huawei in any regard. Huawei is very active in Brazil and quite successful in Brazil for many years. And a lot of Brazil's infrastructure is already based on Huawei, all the telecoms and a lot of the basic digital infrastructure is provided by Huawei. In regards of 5G, Brazil is still on the fence, right? So it has not committed either way. There are pressures on both sides, and we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, really
that's just one of the elements.
Yeah.
So
now, let's go to where do things turn around? How can things turn around? What are some of the things we should look for if you believe things turn around, or if we are going to see a further deterioration?
So yeah, there are two points of view that you can take, and one is the pessimistic point of view. If you play out the scenario of the government that is semi or quasi dysfunctional, and has troubling relations with both, Congress and the Supreme Court, which is, very worrying from an institutional and democratic point of view. You've seen, several demonstrations by the president of, calling, not him directly, but, his proxies or him agreeing implicitly with, movements that, demand the closure of the Supreme Court, or, arresting judges, Congress, closing Congress and restoring the military dictatorship. He himself has, put, more military personnel in key posts of the government, staffed the government with more military personnel than the actual dictatorship did, military dictatorship did, which is, unheard of. And, you have the case where you have, in the middle of a pandemic, three different health ministers, and the last one being a general who never held or had any experience in healthcare, right? And not only him, but 23 of his closest advisors and assistants also are, military personnel with no experience or very little experience in healthcare, right?
And how many of the
So,
cabinet now are retired generals?
oh, in the palace, I don't have the exact number. I want to say around 8 or 9. But like, his chief of staff, like I mentioned, the health minister, the infrastructure minister. There are several military, the chief of security. There's several former military or even active military, which is even more troubling. Like the health minister is active military, active general. That are occupying these key posts in the administration. Now, that is a whole different conversation to go into about, how the military in itself as an institution is reacting to this. And the basic take is that there are divisions within the military itself. But, taking a step back, you mentioned, the pessimistic view is that if you have a very dire economic, fiscal, your hands are tied fiscally, you can't do much more to stimulate the economy. You have a very, harsh scenario with unemployment and people who are already socially, squeezed. Brazil has one of the highest, if not the highest inequality of the world, of major economies. So Brazil is in a very tough spot, and that could translate into greater social unrest or greater political instability in the next 6 months or so.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
On the optimistic view, you see markets rallying from before. They continue to rise, and as in the U.S., maybe you could argue also for different reasons, right? But Brazil's market keeps going up. Things are more or less optimistic in that Brazil will be able to recover after a long decline, just because we've reached the bottom, right? So you've seen another phenomena which is interesting, is that interest rates, and this is to Bolsonaro's credit, have dropped tremendously, and a lot of money that was parked in fixed income. Brazil has been forever been fixed income paradise with high interest rates and easy money to be made. That has changed, and people are starting to shift almost $1 trillion from fixed income into stock market, right? Not all at once, but money is moving from fixed income to equities, and that has been helping also markets in Brazil. And companies have been able to capitalize, and that could promote investment and help a speedier recovery.
Yeah,
So depending on which take you have, it could go either way. Obviously, my personal opinion is somewhere in the middle, that you'll have Brazil continuing to stumble along and manage somehow, but it's not going to be the great success story that it was in the past. And you're going to see the next 2 years of very impressive growth. That's not going to be the case at all.
No, no, fascinating. Yeah, so Kevin, from the point of view of, the great question that we see in that movie, Apollo 13, what do we have on the spaceship that's good? What do we have on the spaceship that works? What's working in Brazil?
So yeah. So amazingly, right after all this dire scenario, there are a few things that are working. I just mentioned, interest rates going down to zero, but that's just basically falling in line with the rest of the world, which I think is a positive sign. Definitely, I would say the agricultural sector and the resource sector is world class, and has been helping Brazil keep its current account balance stable and improving. You have this tremendous energy, and you have tremendous human capital in Brazil that needs to be somehow better coordinated and unleashed, but is there. And you have a tremendous opportunity in Brazil's situation is so bleak in some regards that anything that you do could have a tremendous impact. So a basic area where this is more true than ever is sanitation, right? So Brazil has a huge deficit in basic sanitation and water treatment, and 50% of the country lacks this proper sanitation. And investments, the government is trying to open and has recently approved a law to govern and help bring in investments into the sector, which I think would do tremendous good. There are also talks about having a tax reform. I don't know how that's going to happen politically, but if that were to happen, it would also help Brazil in this growth. But again, a lot of caveats. That is very contingent on how it does politically, and it doesn't seem like it's going to be a very smooth. It's not going to be like a smooth ride, given that the president and his family is facing serious corruption charges as well, which has also helped him moderate his tone and fall more in line with his diminish the attacks on the Supreme Court and Congress, because now he is trying to hold on to his position, and he has even co-opted a part of Congress, bringing in more parties into his alliance, or doling out ministries and pork to some of these parties that have been notoriously part of every government that is able to afford them. Now, for how long, no one knows.
Yeah, and so what do you think the chances are of him getting impeached? Is it 15 or 60?
So as we stand right now, it's very low, basically because for the consensus is, if you have public support at the levels that he has, you can, even if Congress approved, it's a popular, it's not only a political process, but it's also a test of popularity. So as we stand, Brazil or Bolsonaro doesn't face a big risk of impeachment. But if 6 months from now this pessimistic scenario takes place, there are definitely all the reasons and all the prerequisites, the requirements for his impeachment are on the table. So there are criminal charges against him. There are political parties coordinated already around a potential movement, and that could be done. There's a will to do that in certain important sectors, but they don't want. I guess the point is, you can't rock the boat now during this current situation, and there isn't enough popular will to do this. As opposed to Dilma, right? So the establishment was willing to change the government. She did a horrible job.
And throw her overboard.
And throw her overboard, right? So Bolsonaro could face that. I mean, the odds of him serving out his term are not, are not negligible. But they're also, there's a reasonable chance that he might not make the next 2.5 years.
Yeah.
If you ask me if he's going to be impeached in the next 6 months, I don't think so. or if that, process is going to start in the next 6 months, chances are lower.
Great. Well, we have to wrap up, Kevin, but I love talking to you. And I think you and I have had dinner. I was just thinking in like 4 different continents and like 6 countries. So look forward to
I think that's true. Yeah. Besides that being true, I think that you're able to do that with a whole bunch of people, which is, a testament as to how popular and well-traveled and such a jet setter that you are. So on that note, I feel honored to be part of the club.
I'm going to tell the people who watch this that you're still in Rio and you're single and you're one of the most eligible bachelors in Brazil. And so for the women in the audience, you need to get a hold of Ben.
Thank you, Paul.
Your COVID beard looks great.
Thank you very much. You're looking great yourself. Singapore has been treating you nicely.
Running every day with my dog, and we're going to be in lockdown here a long time. We just got news last week that nobody is going to travel, very likely, until the end of the year for any kind of, so forget it.
Yeah, Brazilian passports are not that popular these days either.
I know, right? And so, let's stay in touch, and it was great chatting with you, and this is wonderful, Kevin. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. Always a pleasure. Be safe.